I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. My name is Celia Yapita, and I've come to this work with a lot of experience and learning, and also a lot of humility about the ongoing learning that happens every day. And I've learned so much in my last month and a half, and I try to keep that growth mindset present all the time, because there's always areas to learn. There's so much, and I'm excited to do that. And also, again, as I said, try to do that with a lot of humility. So diversity, equity, inclusion are three words that can mean lots of different things to different people. They have different complicated definitions. But overall, just two statements that are important to make. Everything we are doing here at United Way includes our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we are focused on building a community in which all can participate in creating equitable social transformation. So those are two overarching themes that we are doing every day here at United Way that were started now a couple years ago, if not longer, by the team who was here before me. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So there are some definitions here because it is important to have some shared understanding of what these words mean for all of us. And I think you all may have seen these definitions before, but I wanted to bring them back. So you can read the definition here for diversity. Just take a moment to do that. But it is important to know that each of these has a different aspect. Diversity tends to be about really who is at the table, who is in the room, who is in the discussion, what demographics are reflected in that discussion. It says here realities, background, experiences, perspectives. There's many different ways we can look at the diversity of who's in the room, but it is really important to reflect on that and to have that be as diverse as possible for who we have here in Albuquerque or who we have in the counties we serve. Different communities will have different demographics of who really could and should be at the table. Equity is a different concept. Equity is looking at the treatment, advancement, and access of all of the folks who live in our community. So it's really looking at access to communities, how folks are treated, how they're able to move forward, what opportunities they have, and as it says, are they thriving in their life here in Albuquerque? We look at power imbalances as well with that. Inclusion means creating an environment in which all are welcomed. So inclusion and diversity are definitely, all of these are related, but if you think about diversity, we could bring everyone to the table, but have we made that table or that conversation truly accessible to everyone? So does it feel very inclusive? Did we welcome folks in a way that means that their voices could be heard? So inclusion is really looking at creating an environment, as it says, where everyone feels comfortable sharing and being their true selves. Can they speak up? Do they feel comfortable speaking up? Do they have language access to speak up? In terms of people with disabilities, were they able to enter the room? You know, all of these different pieces, and there's many different layers of that, but that is inclusion. So we see who's at the table, we see whether or not their voices are really being heard once they're there and how we can make that even more welcoming. And then ensuring that whatever community we're all trying to work to help is getting equitable treatment in that assistance, in that moving forward together. Okay. So there are many different reasons to focus on DEI. We could definitely go into a lot of conversations over hours about the different reasons behind why this is important for us to focus on and why more and more organizations, companies, groups are turning to this as a specific intentional topic. So we know that due to systemic and institutional racism, families of color cannot fully participate in our economy. And you can see some numbers here. White households have 13 times the wealth of Black households. And I think it's 10 times the wealth of Latinx households. Among full-time workers, 32% of Latinx workers, and thank you, Randy, I will explain that. And 22% of Black workers are working poor and earn below 200% of poverty compared with 10% of white workers. And thank you, Randy, for pointing that out. Latinx is a term that we use to be more inclusive, to include both Latinos, Latinas, and however else people identify. So you'll see that term. I'll use that term, but please never hesitate to ask if there's any term that seems new or confusing. So you can see these numbers. We have a really big difference in our communities of color and how much spending wealth and how much earning wealth they have with our white communities. So the question that I delved into a bit when Rodney and I read through a few really great articles, which I'm happy to share with anyone, on the economic and business advantages that come from really looking at equity, is the question is, what would happen if all families of color had the same wealth and income as white households? What would that mean for our economy? What would that mean for the money that is out there, that is being spent, that is going into supporting our communities? What would that mean? You can go to the next slide. Thank you, Melissa. So these articles came up with a lot of great statistics. I'm sharing a couple here, but the number here, by 2050, our country stands to realize $8 trillion gain in GDP by closing this equity gap. So if we could, and somehow, and this is the hard part, it's easy to say it, much harder to do it, lessen and then ultimately totally eliminate these disparities and opportunity differentials that are really limiting our communities of color. How much more money would that put into the GDP? $8 trillion. And then in consumer spending, closing that amount, you've got some numbers here: 1.9 billion spent on food, 5 billion in housing, 52 billion on apparel, 259 billion on transportation, 77 billion on entertainment, and federal tax revenues increasing by 450 billion, with local and state as well there. So again, I can share the articles, and there's a lot of good evidence here behind this. The point being that there is so much to gain financially for our entire country, for everyone, not just for our communities of color, but everyone, whether that's white, people of color, all backgrounds, everyone would gain if we could figure out how to close this gap, which again, much easier said than done, but important to consider. So this article also includes a lot of great examples of companies that recognized what was being lost, the money that was being lost to their company by not addressing this issue head on, by not looking at the gaps, by not trying to correct them. And we just got two examples here. One was ShopRite's operator Brown Superstores. Now you've heard of, I'm sure, food deserts. If you do any kind of sociological studying of the United States, you'll see that there are lots of communities, mostly communities of color, where supermarkets don't go anymore. They have very few options of healthy variety of food. And so this particular supermarket decided to go back into those communities and really invest and see, support them, but also see return on investment for taking that time. And this was, and I can give more details, but this is about 7 stores, I believe, in Pennsylvania. And when they did this, they also partnered with community to find out what needs the community had. And so they ended up cohabiting a health center of some sort, a clinic, with the supermarket. And so they worked with community to figure out how they could serve that community better, and then saw this return on investment, saw these revenues and vast increasing numbers of the folks that they were able to serve. And then Gap Incorporated, some of us may shop there, or maybe our kids do. They recognized the cost of high turnover of their employees. And I'd be curious to see how this actually comes out even now. These surveys are a couple years old, or these reports rather. And with COVID too, we know there's been even higher numbers of turnover and folks leaving. But they had high number of turnover, and that was costing their company a lot of money. So they looked into truly investing into their employees, and specifically into employees of color, into young people who could thrive if they had support, but they didn't necessarily have those supports in applying for jobs or getting jobs. So they did a mentoring program, a paid internship program, and then followed those folks and found them to be very successful employees who stayed. And most of the folks who were part of that program were youths of color. So that's just 2 examples, but there are many, many more. And I think this is something that is now on the radar of a lot of different companies to really recognize how they can really turn around, invest some money, and make a really big difference for the community, but also for their bottom line. So as I said, there's also just a variety of different reasons why this is important. I was just sharing a business advantage, an economic advantage to all of us that we would all benefit from, and that some specific companies are already acting on. But there is also, this graphic, I think, is one that we're going to be using more and more, and it really does, I think, show the difference between how we've thought about helping folks or being part of a shared community and how that's changed. When I grew up, I remember hearing equality a lot. I learned a lot about equality in my history classes, and that word was a word that, was used often. The word equity wasn't, though, very much. And you can see from the first picture there, equality, we're looking at giving everyone the same exact thing and how that could help. But equity really looks at the difference that everyone starts at, depending on, just personal limitations, and also depending on the systemic racism that our country has, perpetuated, and helps everyone to get to the same place. But then finally, empowerment, so helping people to reconnect with power that they have, can mean a whole different thing. It can mean sky's the limit. It can mean something very different from something we've imagined before. And that's what we're working towards. Listening to the voices of people who have the lived experience, making sure they're at the table, they feel included, and they can help us and guide us in the best way to better help their communities. So listening and honoring, respecting, and being guided by those voices is really what the last picture there represents. And I think that's my last slide, but I did just want to add one little piece. I know that this came up in one of the questions, I believe, that we received regarding this presentation today. There is a big difference between diversity, equity, inclusion work and critical race theory. Critical race theory, I know, is a very highly politicized term right now in our community, and it honestly, unfortunately, doesn't even really mean what the original term means anymore. But that is really, critical race theory is centered on developing curriculum and teaching, and particularly just in schools, and that is not a part of our efforts here. Certainly understanding history is important as we go forward in this work, but our work will not engage in teaching in the community or in curriculum development or anything along those lines. So just to clarify that for someone who had a question around that, I am happy to dive into that more. That's a very rich and complicated topic as well, and I won't do that right now. And I think as Rodney shares more, you'll see really clearly the direction that DEI United is going and have more clarity around the pieces of it. Okay. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Celia. Nice segue into my piece of the presentation. So, again, this effort started well over a year ago, really at the request of some corporate leaders, really curious about how United Way and the Albuquerque Community Foundation could help impact social equity, just solutions in our community. And so, as I said before, it was really an exercise of building the bike as we were riding it. And as we began to get into the work, it was clear that there were some misperceptions about the work that we were doing in the community. And so we really believed we needed to be pretty clear about what DEI United means in the community. And so we formed the 3 pillars. And the 3 pillars that support DEI United are community engagement, agency funding for BIPOC-led organizations, and equity in leadership. And I'm going to talk through each one of those pillars in the next slides coming up. So next slide. So community engagement, pillar 1. This is all about focusing on how we turn outward in the community to understand the hopes, the concerns, and the aspirations of the community at the grassroots level, and to take action on what we hear. One of the last few remarks that Celia shared was about making sure that we were truly inclusive in this process. And so this is an exercise in providing conditions to co-create solutions with folks in community who are experiencing these challenges most directly. Now, our initial foray into this community conversations model was to provide community conversations with nonprofit partners in 2020 and 2021, essentially with the premise of we wanted to build our muscle in this space, and we also wanted to hear from our nonprofit partners to understand from them what did they see as the barriers, the challenges, and solutions around creating equitable and just solutions in Central New Mexico. So again, these conversations were held essentially over the course of about a year or so, give or take. And we most recently reported out what we heard, the themes that were shared with the nonprofits who participated, as well as extending the invitation to community members who may also be interested could be interested in helping to take action in this space. And let me just pause for a second. Thank you, Randy, for lifting that up. BIPOC stands for Black and Indigenous People of Color. That's a used acronym now in the DEI world. So thanks, Randy, for that notice. Next slide. So what do we hear throughout these conversations? So the barriers were, for example, a lack of energy and sufficient awareness of DEI's importance. So Celia once again got us a little bit of grounding in that, understanding why it matters. We also heard that organizations struggle with resources and exposure, especially in terms of marketing their work. So smaller nonprofits, even some larger nonprofits, finding themselves constrained financially to really engage in outreach and support communities of color. We also heard about personal challenges with diversity, having that difficult conversation or those difficult conversations that Celia lifted up. We don't pretend that these kind of conversations aren't for the faint of heart. Next slide. So some solutions that we heard from the nonprofit leaders were for funders like United Way and the Albuquerque Community Foundation to be strategic and use energy wisely. We know that these inequities will not be dismantled in 1 year. It took a long time for us to get to this point, and we know that it's going to take some time for us to kind of steer this aircraft carrier in the right direction. It was also mentioned that collaboration is important for nonprofit organizations. Funders, whether they are aware of it or not, inspire competition at times instead of collaboration, which was good for us to hear. And then also to work to share information and resources. Next slide, thank you. So some of the concrete actions that we as a collaboration are going to take as a result of this first round of community conversations is to fund the work needed in communities. So we heard that loud and clear from the conversations with these nonprofit organizations around the lack of resources. We also know that it's vital to move from words to action. We have to have a bias towards action to continue these conversations and broaden the scope. So it was suggested, the question was asked, what does DEI look like in rural communities? And then we're to emphasize that helping Black and Indigenous people of color does not harm communities. It only serves to strengthen and improve them. And that's underscored by some of the data that Celia shared earlier in terms of the economic impact that it could have if, in fact, we focused our efforts in this space. So just think about it from the perspective of an abundance mentality where we could grow the pie and that a rising tide floats all boats. Next slide. So what's next when it comes to Pillar 1, community engagement? We're going to hold more community conversations in 2022. The conversations will focus deeper into our community, so getting closer to the grassroots. We hope to re-engage some of our nonprofit partners who participated in these community conversations to have an opportunity to speak to their constituents, their clients, to get a deeper and richer sense about the challenges, to hear from them regarding solutions around addressing some of these barriers. And so we really do look forward to going deeper into community. And once again, we will hold an event that really shares what we've heard, those high level themes that I've shared with you, and to focus our actions where we can take action. And then also, just as importantly, share what we hear from the community with decision makers of all kinds so that they also have an opportunity to take action. We do understand we can't do this work on our own. We need the community to be part of this. So where it makes sense for us to lean in, we will, but we will definitely give true fidelity to making sure that other decision makers have access to this information as well. Next slide. So now this is Pillar 2. So this is all about focusing on strengthening BIPOC-led agencies through funding. So low barrier funding is one piece of this. And so when we talk about low barrier funding, looks like I got a little calendar on the side of my presentation. Thank you. Melissa's having some technological challenges at the office. But low barrier funding, that means that we reduce the barriers that a lot of our smaller and mid-sized BIPOC-led organizations encounter when it comes to applying for funding. Are we asking the right questions? Are we creating conditions where it is too cumbersome or difficult for capacity stressed organizations to apply for funding? And so that's been our approach. This effort is funded by individuals, corporations, and a new partnership with the Kellogg Foundation, as well as some of the McKinsey Scott funds have been devoted to this effort. 2 projects have been funded thus far. So that's building better boards with people of color, and we're supporting the outreach and mentoring efforts of the Asian Business Collaborative. We're really excited because we're going to be making an announcement in the coming weeks about the initial cohort of BIPOC-led organizations that will be funded through our partnership with the Kellogg Grant Funds, and that announcement will be coming soon. So we're really excited about that. Next slide. So here's a spotlight on one of our partners, Building Better Boards with People of Color. This is a project that's funded for 3 years, and it really looks to make sure that there is a pipeline of trained BIPOC staff from across sectors to join either nonprofit or for-profit boards. You can see the vision. We envision a New Mexico with truly representative board of directors who are diverse in their thinking and decision-making. The mission is to train people of color for board positions and provide board-level networking opportunities for them. And the goal is to place every graduate on an appropriate board upon completion of the program. Next slide. So the cohorts, so they just kicked off the cohort a few weeks ago, but the cohort meets monthly for 5 months in the evenings via Zoom. There's instructors and guest speakers from the community, cooperating organizations and directors from different kinds of boards. And upon completion of the course, this is what's important. This is why we are so proud of this partnership. The participants will be placed and matched with an appropriate board of directors based on their unique skill set, insights, and competencies. All participants will speak in future cohorts about their learnings and experiences and be a member of a peer mentor network. Next slide. So this is just an example of the modules. So module 1 is basically focused around the roles and responsibilities of a board member. Module 2 talks about the structure of boards. Module 3 starts to really dig into culture and dynamics, is what, pertaining to what the participants bring to the table from their own lived experience, knowledge, and other attributes. Module 4 is about recruitment and board composition. And then module 5 is really focusing on how participants can bring their experience and voice to the table. So once again, hearkening back to Celia's original comments about it's not inclusion if you're just having folks represented at the table based on their diverse composition, but are they included in the conversation? Do they have a voice? And so that's a key module in this particular program. Next slide. Here's an example of what they're saying. So the participants are saying, I feel much more bold in the boardroom. I continue to reference the materials we received. In fact, we have one particular participant who participated in the initial cohort who works with some of our donor groups. And he has, in fact, brought that learning to structure how their meetings are held. And he harkens back to that and credits his experience with this particular program in building better agendas, focusing on action items and things like that. And boards are saying they can see a difference in the leadership after attending the program, and the growth in their confidence has been amazing. Next slide. So what's next? So there'll be more Kellogg funding for small BIPOC-led organizations. We're looking to fund a second cohort sometime in 2022. And then there will be additional Kellogg cohorts funded in 2022 and 2023 throughout that fiscal year. I did mention that the grant amount we received from Kellogg was $2 million. So $1 million each year will be funded and directed to these smaller organizations to significantly increase their capacity and strength in really addressing some of the challenges and issues of the communities that they serve. We're going to also make grants to BIPOC organizations through the Mackenzie Scott DEI designated fund beginning in 2022. And we made allocations of that Mackenzie Scott fund through 2027. This will be more about BIPOC organizations that may not meet the criteria of the Kellogg cohorts, as well as some other activities that I'm going to reference in a moment. So that's pillar 2. Pillar 3 is all about equity in leadership. And so it is currently under development, but what we are focusing on is creating opportunities to highlight and lift up the contributions of BIPOC staff who work in the nonprofit sector, to provide awareness in the community about their contributions in some public setting, as well as providing funding support for professional development to create pathways and grow their leadership in the nonprofit sector. We intend on launching Pillar 3 sometime in 2022, probably the midpoint of the year, but we will be focused on between now and then really fleshing out some of the details. But I'm frankly very excited about the prospects that this brings to the community in terms of lifting up the contributions of BIPOC staff and growing these leadership pathways in a very effective way. So that's a high-level overview of the 3 pillars of DEI United. What I want to do now is allow an opportunity for Randy and Marisa to chime in. Any thoughts that you have, anything you want to fill in that you feel maybe we didn't cover, or just to talk about the partnership in general. So I'm going to turn it over to Randy and Marisa.
Thanks, Rodney, and thanks for inviting us to join you for one of your Tocqueville Tuesdays. I see them on the email list all the time, but this is my first time to get to connect with you on one of those. And as I look around at your donors that are attending this, as we always talk about, a number of your donors are also our donors. And so I think, one of the things that Rodney and I have been really excited about is the feedback from each of our groups of donors and from the community at large about how pleased they are to see our 2 organizations coming together to work together, not just on this initiative, but a number of initiatives. And Rodney and I and our key staff members are committed to looking for those opportunities going forward. We know we can have a much greater impact coming together on these initiatives. And I might just say to all of you that we at the Community Foundation are really delighted, not just our leadership team on staff, but also our leadership team with our board of trustees at the addition of Rodney to your team, because we are working together like we have never worked together before. Larry Strickland and I have always stayed in touch and looked for opportunities to work together, and Rodney has just grown that exponentially. So we're really grateful for that. We think that our 2 organizations, being the 2 largest public funders, charitable funders, in not just in our community, but the state at large, we have an opportunity to really achieve things that have maybe been visions and goals in the past and have never come to fruition. We really have that opportunity to achieve those going forward. And as you have seen in this great presentation by Celia and Rodney, the principles of DE&I have been integrated into everything at the United Way, and we are doing the same at the Albuquerque Community Foundation. In fact, we have an incoming chair in 2023 who coined a phrase for us a couple of years ago of DE&I in our DNA. We have even gone and changed our bylaws to insert our commitment to DE&I into our bylaws so that it will survive this group of staff and trustee leadership going forward and will be at the heart of everything that we do. I recently, I will share with you, had a trustee who said, gee, are we going to talk about anything but DE&I ever again? And so I chuckled and I began to lay out all the things that we're talking about that are not DE&I, but I called to this trustee's attention that when you've put those principles into your bylaws, when you are publicly stating your commitment, and in particular talking about DE&I and your DNA, you are going to be looking now through a second lens at everything you do in your work. And so both of our organizations always look at, well, how does this new opportunity or this project or this principle align with our mission? So we look at it through the lens of our mission. And now both of our organizations will begin to follow that up with looking through the lens of how does this align with our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'd like to just call out to your attention, if you were paying attention to the slides, you saw lowercase d, uppercase E, lowercase I. And that's not what it always looked like between our two organizations. That's relatively new because we've seen that when you talk about these principles, diversity and inclusion can often be the easier of the three. The tougher one is equity, and perhaps the most important one is equity. And so that's why you will see that laid out. Finally, before I ask Marisa to give just a quick few comments, I want to say, looking at John's face and Sonia's face, it brings me back to our last joint meeting. So those of you who are donors to United Way who may not know this, our respective executive committees have committed to get together on a quarterly basis. And at our last quarterly meeting, somebody, I want to say it was Sonia, somebody made the comment of at the end of the meeting, wow, I'm just looking around the table and listening and watching, and you'd never know that these are two separate organizations. So I think that's a major accomplishment for our community. Marisa, anything you'd like to add?
Thanks, Randy. Hello, everybody. My name is Marisa Magallanes, and I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Equity at the Community Foundation. And I just wanted to lift up one other element of this beautiful partnership, and that is how our the staff of each organization has really worked together in deep collaboration, which, you all as donors know that is something that we love our nonprofit partners to come out organically, is this deep collaboration. And so being able to do that together has been a wonderful experience. I feel very lucky that, most, if not all of the staff on the call have been in work groups together, wrestling through these three initiatives and bringing these projects and programs to life, and also involved in a really deep learning together. And it's been a wonderful way to really practice what we encourage others in our community to do. And I just want to say thank you specifically to all the staff on the call for everybody's work in bringing this partnership to life and the learning that we continue to do together.
And I really appreciate that too, Marisa, because I think that's key. You said a few things in there. Number one, it isn't easy for organizations to work together so seamlessly. And I think that we have essentially mastered that as a collaboration and a partnership. I think we work very well together. And, you mentioned how, we ask organizations that we fund to show us a demonstrable proof of how you're collaborating in the community. And as funders, we ask that, but are we walking that same talk in the community in terms of how we interact with each other? And I think this strong partnership that we have really demonstrates that we are. It's easy to say, well, there's competition, you're two organizations, you need to make sure you're watching your revenue and that you're making impact in your own respective spaces. And that's true. And both Randy and I understand that. But at the same time, and I've said this so many times, Randy and I, beyond wearing the same ensemble today for this call and being of the same mind there, but we do share the same philosophy when it comes to how do we make an impact in community together. So it's less of a scarcity mindset. Again, the pie is only so big. What are you going to do? And it's more about abundance. How can we act as force multipliers in the community to help enhance the quality of life of everyone? And again, one example would be the Kellogg partnership. That is $2 million in additional funding that's going to help support smaller BIPOC-led organizations to build up capacity, to help create outcomes, better outcomes for our communities that you all, everybody on this call, cares about as donors, as leaders. This is what we're striving to accomplish. If Randy and I would have operated in a scarcity mindset, those dollars would not be in our community right now, nor would those organizations have the opportunities presented before them right now. So I'll stop there. And I guess, Melissa, are you going to field the questions? How do we want to do the Q&A session?
Sure. Yeah. If anybody, you can unmute yourself or raise your hand and I'll call on you. That'd be great. I know some of you typed in questions when you RSVP'd, and we tried to cover those in our presentation. But if you feel like you still have questions, please feel free to ask. Yeah.
Melissa, this is Hank Kelly.
Yes.
I think particularly in New Mexico, the faith communities are essential players in this effort. And I sense that their involvement hasn't been as robust as maybe you all had hoped. And I'm wondering what you intend to do to try to get a coordinated working relationship with faith communities within the United Way ACF neighborhood to see that those efforts, those people are included.
I think that's a great question and a great observation, Hank. And know that we are noting this as we are talking about this right now. I think when it comes to the opportunities to invite the faith community in, there are certainly a number of different ways that we can create conditions for that to happen. I think part of it is for us as we look at what we aim to do in the future around community engagement. So I think what, at least at the outset, top of my head right now, and certainly there can be other opportunities, it's really about how do we engage the faith community in this work. So as we build out our goals and our plans for the next year, we definitely want to make sure that we're mindful of doing that. I think, again, while we've done a lot, and I think everybody on this call would agree, we've done quite a bit over the course of the last year or so, there's still areas that we want to focus on and improve. So again, whether it is going deeper into community and having grassroots conversations with folks who are experiencing these challenges firsthand, or inviting in the faith community to be part of this partnership, definitely will be something that we will definitely and strongly consider, because we look at this with the approach that it's going to take the entire community for us to really get our arms around this and help create conditions that everybody wants, right? Everybody wants to live in a safe and thriving community. And we do see it as our role to create opportunities for folks to be invited in to help support this process. So thank you for that question, as well as it is something for us to definitely put a pin in terms of how we want to focus our efforts in the future as we look into 2022 and beyond. I don't know if Randy or anyone else on the call had any other thoughts to chime in on that.
Melissa, I had a comment. Hank, I really appreciate your reminder that we shouldn't leave out the faith community. As an original resident of the Deep South in our country, I remember the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was the main organization that Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement were identified with in the 60s. And a lot of members of the Catholic faith, the Jewish faith, and other Protestant denominations were very active in that movement. And all of those different religious groups continue to be active in our society through politics, through their community involvement, through events, through counseling. Almost everything we do has a dimension where the faith community can have a role. So it made me rethink it when you brought it up too. So thank you.
Celia, you had a comment?
Just honestly to add on to what John said, I know that both the Albuquerque Interfaith and the Catholic community here in Albuquerque have had a lot of sessions and a lot of discussion, and our leaders honestly in talking about a lot of racial equity work already. So they've been doing that parallel probably. And so maybe just making those connections and seeing how we can join our efforts or support them and have them support us and what we're doing as well. So there's a lot of folks doing this work absolutely already.
Great. And Rita, I know you need to jump off, but did you have a question?
I do. So how do you get invited to a community conversation?
So we started the process with our nonprofit partners, the ones we had the closest relationships with, as I mentioned earlier, just so that we could build our muscle. But as we now look at going to the next level in terms of community, we're going to be hashing out that particular process about how we do that. Again, the lowest hanging fruit for us right now will be to start with our nonprofit partners who participated in the community conversations to say, do we have opportunities to talk to your clients, your constituents, and ask them about what they hope for and aspire in the community around this? But if you are interested in participating in a community conversation, definitely let us know and we will take note of that. And I think, again, as we've gone through year one of this process, we are continually looking to improve our processes. So, again, we're not there yet in terms of the end of the process. It's not completely polished. I think we learned a lot through that process of engaging our nonprofit partners. We also learned a lot about what their solutions and aspirations were, as well as the challenges that they laid out. But we definitely will continue to refine this process to make sure that all voices have an opportunity to be heard in our community. So again, Rita, if you're interested, let us know. We'd love to have you.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Melissa, I had a comment. I hereby nominate Brita because on two occasions, one about 20 years ago and one more recently, she gave a fascinating talk on generational differences. And, you know, Generation X, the millennials, Generation Y, baby boomers, World War II generation, whatever. A lot of the views on these issues relate to the generation you're in. What you heard from your parents and grandparents, what type of school you went to, how you entered the workforce, how you interact with people, how you interact with the community, how you got on boards. It's a lot different for, say, someone born in the late 40s or early 50s, from someone in the 70s, from someone in the 90s or the 2000s. Mm-hmm. So I think generational views and outlooks are huge, and sometimes we neglect them. We're concentrating on race, ethnicity, age, urban, rural, you know, the more obvious ones. But I think generational differences color everything we do. And Brita would be a great addition because she's an expert on that.
Yes, I recall one of her presentations on that. It was very interesting. Yeah, great. Thanks for pointing that out. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Melissa, I'm sorry to butt in again. This is Hank. I have one other comment. A concern of mine about this effort is that it not become polarizing and limiting in its own right, and that the goal be inclusion, inclusion, inclusion. When programs are set up to empower specific disadvantaged groups, we see in the United States that those programs tend to exclude others and only include the disadvantaged groups. I'll give you an example which is close to my heart, and that's our Head Start program. Right now, the only way a child can get into Head Start is if the child and his family, her family, meets certain disadvantaged criteria. And no other children of other criteria are there, and no other parents of the other criteria are there working side by side in the Head Start model. I compare that to the preschool co-op on Candelaria, which has been there for about 50 years. Our children, who are now in their late 40s, early 50s, attended that co-op, and we participated with folks of very poor means, of multiple ethnicities, in performing what is now the Head Start model for the benefit of our children, including the culturalization of our kids with children that they would not otherwise associate with. And we see in so many of our programs today, particularly government-funded programs, the exclusion of the very folks with whom we want everybody to be included. And I would hope that we would keep that in mind as we try to tear down the barriers of systemic discrimination by not perpetuating those barriers of systemic discrimination, which in my opinion, we are doing with many of our social programs today. I applaud the effort because I think it gives us an opportunity in the non-governmental sector to show our legislative and administrative leaders of government that there is a better way to skin the damn cat. So that's the comment I have in mind, and I hope that we don't get caught up in the process of what we do itself becoming exclusionary. Oh, shut up now.
I just got to say, I really appreciate your comments, Hank. It looks like, Sonia, you were going to say something?
I just also appreciate those comments because if you look at programs, countries, et cetera, that do things correctly, I'll just, for lack of one that I don't know better, but in Finland, every child, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of socioeconomic background, gets well child checks in their home for the first 2 years of their lives. Every child. Which does two things. It's, to Hank's point, A, it isn't always just disenfranchised parents and families that need that kind of help. B, it puts everybody in a level playing field and says to everyone, this is a necessary component for a healthy society. So that's just one example that I know of, but I do think it's extremely important. It's like free lunches when they started like not giving those to children who couldn't pay the little amount that was due. It's just so shameful and it separates everyone. And so whatever the program is, I just really appreciate those comments, Hank, because only by including everyone can we really tackle these problems. So thank you for your comment.
And I'll chime in on this too. And Randy, I'm going to open the door for you to give your perspective. But, at the outset of this, when Randy and I had this conversation before this partnership was formed about what it could be, it was clear to both of us that it's going to take everybody in order for us to achieve our aspirations in this space. It does require the passion, the drive, the same shared urgency across racial lines in order for us to see the change we want to see. This just cannot be a BIPOC focused effort in terms of the folks leading the charge. That's why Randy and I really arrived at the conclusion that, as leaders of our respective organizations, myself being African American and he being a white man, that it made sense for us to really think about how we could present to the community a model about the kind of change we could accomplish together. I didn't say to Randy, you can't be part of this initiative because you're a white man. I know well enough in my own life experiences and certainly the challenges that we're up against that it's going to take every person, regardless of where you come from or your station in life, for us to be able to meet our goals and aspirations in the community. I don't know if you wanted to speak to that a little bit, Randy.
I don't really have much to add. I think it's been well spoken by Hank and Sonia and you, Rodney, but I do want to just echo my thanks for you bringing that up, Hank. Because, the worst thing that you can do as you are recognizing that there are people excluded, is to turn around and exclude others. And so I think it's at the forefront of our mind. Many of you may have heard the term white allies, and it refers to the fact to be able to pull this work off, we have to have all groups included, and there have to be white allies for this to be successful. I mean, the bottom line is when we look at our respective staff and boards and donors, they lean heavily to white. And so we can't be excluding white folks in trying to accomplish these goals that we believe brings a more inclusive community at large. And, I think what's incumbent upon all of us is to think about really, what is my piece? How can I make a difference? How can I move this work forward? I've told a story before that I won't tell right now, but I have a daughter who has written nationally and a few years ago wrote about white male privilege. And she happened to mention my name in this article that was all over the country. And I thought, oh my gosh, don't you know what I do for a living? How could you suggest that about me? But when I took the time to research and to understand what is meant by white male privilege, even though I came from a lower middle class family, first person to be college educated, all sorts of things, nonetheless, I recognized that I had white male privilege. And so now I believe my responsibility is how can I take that and make a difference to bring about a more inclusive society, a more inclusive community right here in Albuquerque as an example for our entire state.
Thank you both. In respect for time, I know we said this ended at 1, but we want to invite anybody to stay on that would still have any questions. We have a few more minutes, I think, with everybody. So anybody else? All right. Well, I just thank you all for joining us today. It was great to see you, and we hope to maybe resume these in person sometime next year. But welcome you to contact us anytime with any questions that you have, or concerns, or comments, and any involvement that you want to do in this work with us. So thank you. Good afternoon.
And also, if you haven't liked or subscribed to us, please do.